This is our second time in Isaiah, as you mentioned, Christine. And last time we were in Isaiah 1 and 2 and 5, particularly. Um, and a lot of the prophets are about doom and gloom, but it's kind of well deserved. And we'll see that more this evening. So we've been focusing on the judgment passages, but if you're going to talk about social ethics and social justice, you cannot get around the idea of judgment. Injustice, oppression, violence has to be judged. And so that's what you'll find in the Old and the New Testament. And we focused on that. Um, and what we find over and over again, and after a while, everyone may get a bit tired of this, but the idea of social justice within the people of God over and over again is connected to worship because it is there that we nurture a people of justice. It is there that we meet God as he truly is. And if we get God wrong in the worship services, then we will live wrongly and we'll be actually worshiping another God. So we looked at that. We'll look a bit more at that today in two passages I know that Christine and the Matthew 25 initiative goes to a lot, which would be Isaiah 56 and 58. And then next time, what we'll do, we'll look at some explicitly hope passages in the book of Isaiah. Some of those that you would obviously know. At the very least, we'll look at chapter 9 of Isaiah and then chapter 11. Like I said last time, we looked at chapters 1 and 2. And in chapter 1, there's this long diatribe from verses 10 to 20 against the worship going on in Jerusalem at the temple. And he mentions every kind of religious activity you can think of, sacrifices, prayers, um, oaths, everything, singing. Other passages do as well. And in chapter 2, we'll hit at a key thing that is important in the prophets. And it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. And that is a lot of human sin is grounded in our arrogance. Our arrogance, we want to play God, which means that we will lord it over others. When God plays God, it's gracious, it's life-giving. You see this in Genesis 1 and 2. When humans play God, we do it by suppressing somebody else. We do it by eliminating others. We do it by making sure that we can be in control. And this happens individually, it happens at societal levels, and it happens at national levels too. I mean, and the arrogance is inculcated in every country in the world. I mean, the MAGA thing, make America great again. I mean, that's Genesis 3 writ large about being the best and being like God. But if you would look at around the world throughout history, this is not a new concept at all. I mean, every country, whether you want to talk about China or Russia or even small countries in Latin America, where there's this national pride, some of it's not bad, of course, but it can get twisted and used against others. And that's very much of a human tendency. We'll come back to that. So pride is especially hard hit in chapter 2 of Isaiah. And then in chapter 5, we get a series of woes that we looked at last time. Today, we'll be looking at 56 and 58, both of which deal with worship, fasting, and the Sabbath. But it's going to be interesting to see how those passages engage it. Now, a passage that can be a nice entryway, and I think I mentioned this last time, is in Amos chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. So if you have your Bibles, if you can look for Amos chapter 4, verse 4. And I think the wording is important, and it's something that we'll see tonight in the book of Isaiah. But the prophet says, go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal and sin yet more. These are historic worship sites, sanctuaries in ancient Israel. And what he's saying is their worship is sin. And when they go to worship, they're just sinning. And he says, keep doing it, and you're just going to be sinning some more. But he gets to something that's very important in the verses or the lines that follow, because he says, bring your sacrifices every morning, which they didn't have to, but he's exaggerating, and bring your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering, and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites. And here's the line that's so crucial, for this is what you love to do. And so what we find in any religion of the world is people will get involved in religions and religious activity because it's very self-fulfilling. It's about meeting our expectations. It's about going to a worship service that we like, hearing sermons that we like. We see our friends there. Again, this isn't unique to Christianity, but this is the idea. You see, we love to do these things, and so we do them. Now, if you were to look more carefully at the things that the prophet lists for them to do, they're all about celebration and thanksgiving. There's nothing about sin here. So what he is saying is they are enjoying a worship or a religion of celebration. In the lines that follow, which we will look at more in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, is he just lists a series of disasters. The idea being there is nothing to celebrate. There is nothing to be thankful for. Instead, it should have led you to lament. It should have led you to rethinking what your religion and your worship services were all about and your concept of me. And this will culminate in verse 12 of chapter 4, where he will say, prepare to meet your God. Now, in the ancient world, to meet God, you would go to sanctuaries. In our day, because of history and the pietist movement and things like this, a lot of times we conceive of meeting God by ourselves alone in a room. Or you go to a retreat center and you go up to the top of a mountain or something. And the idea is to be alone with God and you meet God there. Well, I'm not denying that. But in the ancient world, you would primarily think of meeting God at the sanctuary, where God had his throne and where you would have all the ceremonies and the sacrifices and things like this. So if he is saying, prepare to meet your God, their response would have been, well, we meet him all the time. And what he's telling them is that they don't. So let's dive into Isaiah, because he's going to go along the same lines. And again, I think, because I think Christine told me this, these are passages that you all like in Matthew 25. So let's go to chapter 56 in Isaiah. And you have an announcement in verse 1 where he says, maintain justice. Now, the Hebrew word there, in English, this version, I'm using the NIV, says maintain. But it's really the idea of guarding, of keeping watch. So it's more than maintain. It's kind of an active making sure that you're protecting it, that you're promoting it, you see. So I think that's probably why the NIV chose the verb maintain. But the verb in Hebrew is the idea of keeping watch and keeping safe and doing what is right. So it's not just an orientation, so to speak. It's actually in some actual involvement in things that he's encouraging them and demanding that they do. And what he'll say in the second part of the verse is he gives them the reason why. For my salvation is close at hand. Now, when he's giving this, the prophet, they will be coming back from exile. So salvation here is more in the socio-political, historical sense of coming back to the land. But for us, of course, our salvation has come in the person of Jesus. So if he is giving the reason to be this way and to think this way and to act this way based on their salvation, well, of course, that hits close to home for us because we have our salvation, which should be the motivation for maintaining justice and doing righteousness. So I think that's an important concept because you cannot separate the person of God and the reality of our salvation from the idea of guarding justice and doing righteousness. And this is where he moves into the Sabbath idea. Blessed is the one who does this, he says, the person who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath without desecrating it, and keeps their hands from doing any evil. So he's talking about ritualistic worship, weekly for them on the Sabbath. And so as he will move into talking about these things, he's not saying that the Sabbath is bad or that liturgical worship and services are bad. In fact, it would just be a given. In the ancient world, you could not conceive of worshiping a god apart from rituals. It would not make any sense at all. It would not make any sense to do this apart from a temple or a sanctuary. So periodic rituals, this is part of ancient life. And of course, it's part of our life too. But keeping the Sabbath is the same word that you find in that verse 1 about maintain. It's the same idea here with keeping the Sabbath without desecrating it. See? So what you're seeing is rituals can be desecrated. They can be made unholy by what we do and what we think. And so he now will explore for us how we do this, and he's going to do it in a very different kind of way than we might imagine. Because what he'll do, he'll talk about opening the welcome to the Sabbath. Now, he's going to mention two kinds of people. He's going to mention the foreigner, and then he'll mention the eunuch. Now, the foreigner, again, you've got to think ancient world. Okay? So we're thinking, oh, the immigrant. Well, that's true. But the foreigner in their world would have been someone who, as they would come in, would worship another god, would have another lifestyle based on their worship of another god. Okay? But look at this kind of foreigner. This foreigner is bound to Yahweh. So this is the foreigner that's come to the worship of God. The Lord will surely exclude me from his people. This is what he's thinking. You can just process this with Christian immigration, all the millions of Christians that have come in from Latin America, for instance, where they're wondering, will the church accept them? Will the people of God include them? And sadly, what we see is oftentimes that's not how it works. The second person that he mentions is the eunuch. And a eunuch in the ancient world would have been a castrated male. Now, this is prohibited in the law, castrating a male. But again, you've got to put it into the ancient context. This would probably be someone from another culture. And the eunuchs, it was not uncommon for a man who had been castrated to work for the king and to be in control of the harem. Now, if the harem was the group of women that were part of the king's entourage, a king would not have to worry about a eunuch getting involved with any of his wives or his concubines. So he could trust the eunuch. And so we're talking about a different kind of thing. So again, probably someone from the outside, someone from a different culture and a different way of being. But because he was a castrated male, the response of the people would have been, kind of hands off. You can actually see this in ancient reliefs of eunuchs, where you'll see men with beards, on stone, but then you'll see men who are clean shaven around the throne. And so those have probably been eunuchs because of the lack of testosterone. Now, I want to show you, this is a little Old Testament detail kind of thing, but this is how you'll see the beauty of how the passage is constructed. Because what you see, if you look on the outline, he begins with the foreigner, and then he'll talk about the foreigner in verses 6 and 7. He'll talk about the eunuch, and then talk about the eunuch in 4 and 5. So what you have is the foreigner is at the beginning and at the end of this section, and the eunuch is in the middle. So you have what's called the chiasm effect, where you have things mirroring each other, right? Parallel, beginning and the end, and then the two in the middle are doing that as well. So when he gets to talk about the eunuch in the last part of verse 3, then he gets back to the eunuch, beginning in verse 4. But if you look in verse 3, the eunuch says, I am only a dry tree, meaning that a tree that will not bear fruit. And what he's saying is, will have no children. For this is what Yahweh says, or the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths. Again, what you're seeing, they've come to faith in Yahweh, and choose what pleases me, and they hold fast to my covenant. To them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name. What's one of the fears in the ancient world? If you don't have children, your family will disappear, your name will no longer exist. But God will give these people, these men, without seed, a name, an everlasting name, better than sons and daughters, he says. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. So what you're seeing is this gracious welcoming to someone who has been castrated and marginalized in the society, and now he's bringing them in. But these are people that are actually an example to the people of God, even though they're from outside. They're holding fast, they're believing, they're pleasing God, and they're keeping the Sabbath. And then he goes to the foreigner from another religion, but now has come to faith in God. And foreigners who bind themselves to Yahweh, there it is, that same idea, to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and those who hold fast to my covenant. There's the idea again. These I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in the house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted at the altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer to all nations. So what you have is this wide welcome, including people who socially and culturally would have been marginalized, sometimes despised and shunned, being brought in because of their faith, and actually they become a model for those all around them who would be the regular people of God. And then what you see to close out the passage, the sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles of Israel will gather still others. These are the still others, the eunuchs and the foreigners, besides those already gathered. So what you're seeing again is this focus on a liturgical practice, the Sabbath, being practiced by people from outside. They are holding fast to it. They love God. They keep his commandments. And therefore the Sabbath that they practice is enjoyed by God and blessed by God. And they're blessed in ways that their society normally would not bless them. So let's look at Isaiah 58. And we're going to get back very clearly to this idea of religion and ethics are inseparable. We saw it in Isaiah 1, briefly in Amos chapter 4, other passages and other prophets. We saw it in Isaiah 56, but the exemplars, right, were actually different kinds of people. Well, now it's coming home to roost. Now it's the people of God. And once again, we begin with announcement in verse 1. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. So he's obviously trying to get their attention, right? Shout it aloud. Don't hold it back. Raise your voice. Threefold repetition. Listen. But look what he tells for them to listen to. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. So what he wants them to pay attention to is their sin. And what he will begin to describe, even as we saw in Amos chapter 4, is that their sin are the sins of their religious life. So we have some indictments in chapter 58, verses 2 through 4. For day after day they seek me out. Okay? They would seek him out, especially in the temple. They seem eager to know my ways. If they were a nation, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commandments of its God. So it's interesting. We'll come back to this word several times in this passage, but the NIV will translate this seem eager to. Actually, it's pleasing to them. Okay, it's going to be this idea of pleasing to them and pleasing to God is going to come up several times, but here they translate it as eager. So, are they being very religious? Every day, they're seeking after God, and it is pleasing to them, at least seemingly, to know His ways. All that sounds pretty good. But then you get as if they were a nation that does what is right. And if they were like a nation that has not forsaken the commands of its God. So what you have is you can be very active in religious life. You can be very active in seeking God in all these kinds of activities. He's going to focus on one in particular. But they're rebellious. They don't obey God. They ask me for just decisions, and it is pleasing to them for God to come near to them. That's what they want. That's why it says, seem eager. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you haven't noticed? What they're trying to get is God's attention. Okay? If I do what is right, and if I do this in worship, God will be pleased. God will be delighted. This is the word I've been talking about. They delight in this. Okay? It's pleasing to them. The NIV seems eager to them, but it's actually the idea of delight and pleasing. See, they really enjoy this. This is kind of what we saw in Amos chapter 4. But this is what you love to do. So he's hitting hard at this idea. And now, besides talking in generalities about they're not obeying the commandments, and actually, in their minds, God is the one who is to blame. Okay? Why isn't he looking at us? Why isn't he paying attention? But he says at the end of verse 3, yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. So what we have here, and you also see it around the Old Testament, when you go into worship, what is it that you seek from God? You seek for him to see you and to hear you. And what he's saying in the verses we've just read is, they complain because he doesn't see them or doesn't look at them. And now what we're getting is, he doesn't hear them either. So he's totally shut them off, visually and by hearing. This is what they want to do. This is the fast. Now, um, a fast is not just a religious activity where you kind of show up. It's not even an activity where you offer a sacrifice. A fast is where you deprive yourself of something. See? So this would be actually very self-sacrificial. Okay? It's not bringing something else, another thing. It's not, singing, that may be part of the ceremony. It's actually, they're depriving themselves of something, which makes it, in their minds, much more serious. But you have this split between this religious activity, which is commendable, but they don't pay their workers. And actually, they're pretty nasty. They quarrel, they strife, they even get into fistfights. Okay. So it's not what you'd call very godly people, but they are very religious people. And if you were to ask them, do you believe in Yahweh? The answer would be yes. Look at all that we do. Look at all that we give up. Okay. And it actually is really uncomfortable how much we give up. So you move from what they understand religion to be and how they choose to live it out. Now beginning in verse 5 through 7, what you begin to see now is what God chooses. What kind of fast does he choose versus the kind of fast that they have chosen? Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for my people to humble themselves? Now, the idea of humbling themselves, that sounds positive. Would God want us to humble ourselves? Yes, but not this kind of way. Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Again, not only am I giving up something, I'm not consuming something I normally will consume, I'm actually covering myself with ashes. It's a very public display of grief and of lament and woe. Is that what you call a fast? A day that delights, there's that idea again, delights Yahweh? Is that what you think? He actually enjoys watching this and hearing this? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? Now he's going to tell you. Not the kind they have chosen, all the noise, all the visuals. This is the kind that he wants. To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke and set the oppressed free and break every yoke. It's actually helping those who are vulnerable, who are suffering injustice. And look at the idea of a yoke. It's a burden they bear. A yoke would be something you would put onto work animals to plow the fields, to pull a cart. These are burdens that they carry, whether for work or for something else. The cords, you see, they're tied up, they're vulnerable, they can't get out of it. And the idea is setting them free, taking the yoke off their back and off their neck. Isn't that to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? So it's helping those who are vulnerable and being exploited, those workers you talked about before. It talks about helping those who are hungry, and there are laws in the Old Testament about feeding the hungry. Those without shelter, the word we would use today would be homeless. When you see the naked, to clothe them, and to not turn away from your own flesh and blood. I mean, these are your own countrymen. Okay? These are people right next to you. These are people you might even know, but at the very least, they're your countrymen. Now, in that world, we're talking about village life primarily. The cities were small. Jerusalem at this point might have 5,000 people, 10,000 people. Most people lived in villages of 80 to 100 people, oftentimes of extended family, but you would have known everybody. So you would be pushing aside people that you would know, not just strangers, but people you probably knew and maybe even literally your own flesh and blood. Because in the villages, like I mentioned, you had extended family. So what you have is this structure where you have what God wants, and then if you do it, there's a word of blessing. So it says, then your light will break forth like the dawn. Your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you. Everyone will see it. Not because you're advertising it, but because it will be incarnate. It will be visualized. It will be clear. And the glory of Yahweh, of the Lord, will be your regard. It will be on public display, and God's presence also will be obvious to you. And then you will call. Now, remember what they had said earlier. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. See, he will hear you. And you will cry for help. Because all of us, even if we're well placed, and he will say, here am I. And if you do away, again, the exhortation, and we're going to get another promise, and if you do away with the yoke of oppression, the yoke that he mentioned just a few verses before, and with the pointing finger and malicious talk, I mean, it's a great visual. See? What's the pointing finger and the malicious talk? See? It's slander. It's blaming them. You're pointing the finger at them. They're the ones. You see, it's their fault. This is what they deserve. And if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, see? This is beautiful language. Again, he'll go back to the metaphor of the light. Then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The darkness all around them, now they become light to the world. And you can see how Jesus picked this up in the New Testament. And now their light will be obvious to all. The yokes will be lifted. The hungry will be fed. The poor will be taken care of. There won't be slander. There won't be vicious talk. There won't be underpayment of workers and all these kinds of things. And then he says, Yahweh, the Lord, will guide you always, and he will satisfy your needs. As you help those in need, he satisfies your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. And your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations, and you will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. So you get this kind of structure where this is what he wants, promise. This is what he wants, promise. And so you get that repetitive cycle in this passage. In the last passage, we have a different structure. In this passage, we have the repetition of the structure of exhortation, followed by a promise, exhortation, followed by a promise. And you can see the exhortations are echoing and reversing what they were doing in terms of their fasting. So there is self-deprivation, and there is giving of oneself and doing without, but not for oneself to be seen and heard by God, but actually self-deprivation to help others. And when we do that, God will hear and God will see, and that's the proper kind of fast. Now, he's not saying don't fast. Okay? He's not saying that. He's just saying fast the right kind of way. Yeah, let's look at last couple of verses. Because now he's going to go back to the Sabbath. So in a sense, you're going back to Isaiah 56. You're going to hear echoes of the same language. So he's talked about the Sabbath, 56, the fast, and now we're back at the Sabbath. So you're kind of a bookmarkers here. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, okay, and for doing as you please, there's that idea again. Okay? What pleases you? What delights you? You know, earlier in verses 2 and 3, the NIV has eager, but it's the idea of delighting in something. See, what is it that they're delighting in? They're delighting in all their religious work and feeling so good about themselves. But here the same thing. And if you can keep from doing what delights you on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please, what delights you, or speaking idle words, okay, then you will find your joy in the Lord. I was just thinking of that song that the music, right? The joy, the joy, the joy of the Lord. There it is. You will find the joy of the Lord. Because the Sabbath is supposed to be the time you set aside for God. Okay? So, in a periodic kind of way. So, if we have the right attitudes for this, and this is something I have to deal with, going to church on a Sunday. But if it's a delight, and if I honor the Sabbath day, um, then I will find the joy of the Lord. And that can be hard going to church because you're actually with real people. So, and you would know this as a pastor's wife. That can get complicated. All kinds of things go on in a church. All kinds of sinful people gathering together once a week. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. The Lord has spoken. So, religious activities, spaces for ethics, and you really can't have Christian ethics without liturgy. That's what helps keeps it Christian, and that's what helps define it. And that keeps us going back to the source of why we do this and the source of our strength. And also helps us understand and visualize the God of our faith. And so it should be kind of this dialectical mutual enrichment. Our involvements, or the involvements of Matthew 25 in our worship services.